group. So feel free to ask your questions if you want as I go through the slides, or you can save them to the end, whatever you would like. All right. All right. So November is Diabetes Awareness Month, and I thought this would be such a great opportunity to discuss diabetes, prediabetes, insulin resistance, and how it relates to the South Asian population. It's really startling, actually, when you look at the statistics. And South Asians are at such a high risk for developing this chronic condition. And the thing is, diabetes is preventable. So the more we know, the more we are educated, the more better choices we can make. We can delay this onset or even prevent it from happening in the first place. Um, Maybe you know someone who is living with diabetes. I'm pretty sure you do. Again, in the South Asian community, heart disease, diabetes are so rampant. And diabetes is a chronic condition. So what that means is that once you get diabetes, it's a progressive disease. So once you get diabetes, it's really hard to reverse that, and it progresses. And during this webinar, you will learn, a lot about the complications and, what diabetes is and how to prevent it and what you can do. So the objectives of this presentation is that I'm going to be discussing about diabetes and its complications and have a better understanding why South Asians are at such a high risk for developing type 2 diabetes. You're going to have a better understanding of insulin resistance and the role of visceral fat. We're going to also be doing a lot of discussion on the South Asian cuisine, and we're going to be looking at some of the pros and some of the cons. And, I'm going to be giving you some ideas for making some food swaps that you can incorporate in your cooking. We're also going to be discussing the role of exercise and sleep to help manage blood sugar and insulin levels. We are also going to be talking about meal timings. I'm going to touch a little bit about fasting as well to manage insulin and blood sugars. I'm also going to be discussing supplements that also helps with blood sugar management and insulin resistance. So a lot of information, like I mentioned. I really want this to be informative. I really want to give you guys actionable steps that you can start implementing today. Uh-oh. Oh, here we go. Okay, so I already introduced myself. So I'm a registered dietitian and diabetes educator. I'm also a clinical dietitian at the Metcon Clinic in Toronto. And I'm also a virtual dietitian. So since COVID happened, I've moved my practice to an online space. So I see a lot of my clients virtually. And my specialty is in prediabetes, diabetes, PCOS, and insulin resistance. Okay, so just some statistics about diabetes in Canada. So, diabetes is a disease in which your body can't produce insulin or can't use insulin properly. Sorry, I have a typo there. So, insulin is a hormone which is produced by your pancreas. Okay, so insulin role is to regulate the amount of sugar in the blood. So, when you eat something that breaks down into sugar, it could be an apple, it could be a piece of candy, it could be a drink. It could also be rice. Okay. Any food that has carbohydrates breaks down into glucose. So once that glucose, that sugar, enters our bloodstream, insulin is released from the pancreas, and insulin is like a chaperone and it picks up those sugar molecules so it can deliver it into the cell. Okay. So that's such an important role of insulin. And currently, 11 million Canadians are living with diabetes or prediabetes. And like I mentioned earlier, there's a huge possibility that someone who is living with diabetes. And as of now, there is no cure for diabetes. Okay, there's a lot of medications, but there's no cure. So lifestyle and diet choices are a form of medication, and this is why I really enjoy this space as a dietitian, because I can see firsthand how your lifestyle and your diet choices can make a huge impact on your disease prevention. It's very, very powerful. So, some of the complications with diabetes, so like I mentioned, right, it's a progressive disease. So, once you have it, you likely will always have it and it will progress over time. Okay, so it's really important if you have diabetes that you manage it properly, because if your blood sugar runs really high, there's a ton of complications that can happen. Okay, so type 2 diabetes can lead to a variety of complications that affect your body from head to toe. So that includes stroke, blindness, amputation, and more. Now, again, these are very serious, like kind of the end of the extreme. This is someone who's, not taking their medication, who is not, eating well or taking care of themselves, right? So this kind of like the end of the extreme. But kidney disease can definitely affect you more if you have diabetes, because your kidney is the organ that filters everything. So when you have a lot of blood sugars, if you have a lot of glucose in your blood, your kidney has to work really, really hard to filter all that sugar out, right? So it's getting worked really, really hard. So as a result, if you're constantly in a state of high blood sugars, your kidney is going to get taxed. Okay. Erectile dysfunction. So you guys, I want you guys to think about, right? Like when you have too much sugar in your blood becomes thick. I want you to think of the consistency of honey, right? And your blood is needed for every single organ in our body. So when we have impaired blood flow, it affects everything. So, you want the consistency of your blood to be like water, that's fluid, that can move more efficiently. So if it's like honey, it's going to get stuck, it's not going to flow properly. And as a result, erectile dysfunction is a complication of high blood sugars. And this can also manifest into heart disease as well. So eye damage, so diabetic retinopathy. So many people that I know sometimes get diagnosed with diabetes at their eye doctor. So the small vessels behind our eyes, right? They flow blood. They're very, very tiny blood vessels, and sometimes they get enlarged. They get, so the eye doctor can see that when they're testing your eyes, and that's how many people can actually get. That's how they get diagnosed is through an eye exam, which is pretty crazy, because those blood vessels are really tiny, so they do expand, and that's how your optometrist can tell. So, heart disease and stroke. People with diabetes may develop heart disease 15 years earlier than those without diabetes. So, like I mentioned earlier, right, blood flow is everything. Anything that impairs your blood flow, obviously your heart is the major organ that pumps blood everywhere, right? So, that is the major risk factor for diabetes. So, typically, if are diagnosed with diabetes, your doctor will automatically put you on some heart medications just for prevention, because this is the biggest risk factor. High blood pressure, sometimes, and I'm going to be explaining to you what insulin resistance is. But sometimes high blood pressure, you may be diagnosed with high blood pressure. And I want you to think of this as a red flag, because this could increase your risk for developing insulin resistance, which then can progress into prediabetes and type 2. Mental health. So, one of the complications of diabetes is anxiety and depression. It's also known as diabetes distress. So, diabetes, because there's no cure for it, you really need to be on top of your medications and your blood sugars. And this is a lot of work. It's very exhausting for someone who is trying to control their blood sugars. It's really stressful. So, mental health issues with people who have diabetes are much higher. So that's something to take into account as well. And then nerve damage, right? This is where you can lead to amputation, is that the nerves, because remember, right, the blood is flowing everywhere, but if you're not getting sufficient blood flow, it can result in nerve damage, especially in our extremities, like our fingers and our feet, and the extent of that, which can lead to amputations. Okay, so I don't want to scare you guys, but I just wanted to highlight some of the complications when it comes to diabetes, and just for you guys to understand that all of this is completely preventable, absolutely. And I'm gonna show you how you can do that, how you can prevent that. Okay, so this statistics, I hope you can see this clearly. So South Asians are six times more likely to develop type 2 diabetes than the general population. There are certain ethnic groups that are at risk. South Asians are the highest, which is pretty alarming. Okay, and I want to explain to you why this is the case. And it doesn't have to, it's not necessarily the rice that we eat and the sugars that we eat. Yes, that plays a part, but it's not that clear cut. There's a lot of genetic variations in our body that puts at us at risk. So that's what I'm going to go into right now. So, why South Asians? Okay, so I'm going to explain. I don't want to get too technical, but I just want you to understand this better because I feel that if you understand the why, it's going to be easier to make some of these changes. So, South Asians in general have been known to have less muscle mass, okay, and more fat, more abdominal fat. And this increases insulin resistance. And studies have shown in Canada, actually, there were studies done at hospitals for at newborns, and they were seeing that even though South Asian, babies were at a normal birth weight, like 6 pounds, 7 pounds, right? Birth weight was absolutely okay, but when they looked at their body fat, they had more abdominal fat. So this is happening at birth, during pregnancy, just in our genetic makeup. This is just how we are, how South Asians are. So we just have more abdominal fat. And as you guys will see and learn, that this is the biggest risk factor for developing type 2 diabetes. And in the next slide, I'm going to go over a little bit more about how and why this is the case. Okay. So imaging results like MRIs have shown that so like South Asians who may have a healthy weight and a healthy BMI, they typically have more fat around their organs and in the belly area than Europeans with the same BMI. Okay, so that visceral fat, this is the most dangerous type of fat to have. And unfortunately, as South Asians, we just have more of it. So the reason why is that South Asians, studies have shown that have a lower beta cell function. Okay, so beta cells are in the pancreas that stimulate insulin. Okay, so we just don't have enough beta cells. We have a dysfunction of our beta cells, so we're not producing that much insulin. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. So we're not producing that much insulin as a race or as an ethnicity group. And, coupled with the fact that we just naturally have low muscle mass, that doesn't help the situation. Okay. And also, yes, South Asian, our diet and our lifestyle trends also play a part as well, which I will be talking about. Okay, so I just want to show you guys the pancreas. This is the pancreas. It's an organ right underneath our stomach. And inside the pancreas, we have our beta cells. Okay, so this is a normal beta cell. And you can see the beta cells are all there. Lovely. So when our body senses sugar in our body, these beta cells produce insulin, which then carries those sugar molecules into the cells for energy. Okay. Now, with South Asians, what studies have shown is that our beta cells are impaired. They're not working that great. So, yes, we do have beta cells, but not as much as some other people. So, this is a problem because our body's not producing sufficient insulin. And when our body doesn't produce enough insulin, those blood sugars are staying in our body longer, right? They're not getting they can't enter the cell without insulin. Insulin is like the chaperone or the key. So that's one reason why South Asians are at such a high risk. It has to do with our genetic makeup and the fact that we don't have, a good supply of beta cells. Now, just briefly, I wanted to talk about type 1 diabetes. Type 1 diabetes is incredibly different than type 2 diabetes. Type 2 diabetes is something that happens usually at a later age, like later in life. However, we are seeing younger people being developed with type 2 diabetes just because of their lifestyle. But type 1 is usually diagnosed at a very young age, like at children, and this is an autoimmune condition. And this is where, how I said South Asians don't have the best beta cells? So in type 1, they don't have any. They have absolutely zero beta cells. So, and they attack itself. So it's an autoimmune condition. So they just need insulin right away. All right. So that's type 1 diabetes. So hopefully that makes sense. If you guys have any questions, please ask. So hopefully this helps you understand, when I said South Asians have beta cell dysfunction, it just means that our beta cells don't look like this one, like this cell. They look similar to this. Maybe not as bad, but they don't have that many beta cells. So we're not producing enough insulin. All right. So insulin resistance, okay? So this is another factor So we have beta cell dysfunction, and then we have insulin resistance. So this in combination puts us at such a huge risk. So insulin resistance is when your cell is actually resisting insulin. So insulin is there, okay? You may have enough insulin that acts like a key, opens the door to the cell so the glucose can go in, so the glucose can enter. And once the sugar enters a cell, it's used for energy, okay? So if someone has insulin resistance, that means that there's receptors on our cell that kind of attach to the insulin molecule so that the doors open and sugar can go in. So when you have insulin resistance, your cell is not your cell is not functioning that well. And this happens when we have too much fat around our body. So when we have, think of your cell here and think of layers of fat, right? So it's just so much harder for insulin to do its job because the fat is in the way, and we know, right? Like I explained earlier, that South Asians have more more visceral fat. So we're kind of in like a double-edged sword, right? So yes, we have more fat, which causes us insulin resistance. And then also how our insulin produced is also not ideal. So that in combination is the reason why South Asians are at such a high risk. And then obviously, our diet and lifestyle doesn't help either. So this is kind of, hopefully this makes sense to you, that this is kind of the big picture on why South Asians are at such a high risk. So it has to do a combination of how our insulin is produced in our body because of the beta cells, and the fact that we carry more fat in our body, which makes it hard for our organs to work efficiently. So what happens is that we have too much sugar floating around in our blood. So that is known as hyperglycemia. So you have too much sugar. And over time, this sugar can lead to type 2 diabetes, right? So we have a combination of beta cell dysfunction as well as insulin resistance. So these two progresses into having high blood sugars, which then progresses into prediabetes, which then progresses into type 2. So if anyone here or has a family member that has been diagnosed with prediabetes, this is good, because when you are diagnosed with prediabetes, you have 100% control to reverse that to get to normal levels. If you are automatically diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, you can definitely manage it, but you can't go back to the normal state. So prediabetes, a lot of people I work with are in the pre-diabetes phase, and I actually really enjoy working with this population because we can take their numbers and make them into normal again, so they don't need to worry about it. And that's the goal. And I'll explain to you, why it's so important to obviously get your blood work done every year. And I know with COVID, it's been very challenging to see your doctor, but really, really make that appointment to get your blood work done once a year. Right. So any kind of trends in your cholesterol and your blood sugars, you can kind of look at that to see if that's progressing or if that's going, into a better direction. So again, just to recap, the reason why South Asians are at such a high risk has to do with our insulin resistance because we carry more fat in our body, and it has to do with our beta cell dysfunction as well, right? So this is not an ideal situation. So insulin resistance, okay? So insulin resistance can happen like 10 years, before your blood sugars are elevated. Okay. So how do you know if you have insulin resistance? And I'm going to be talking about this, but insulin resistance can manifest in so many other health conditions. So for example, fatty liver. This is so common in our community with South Asians. So this means that our liver just has a lot of fat around it, right? Which is not surprising because South Asians carry more fat. So fatty liver, if you have been diagnosed with fatty liver, that means you have insulin resistance. All right, PCOS. So many women, so many South Asian young women actually that I work with have PCOS, which is polycystic ovarian syndrome. And this is a result of having insulin resistance. So they're not able to produce female hormones efficiently, which then impacts fertility. Okay, this is a huge rise in our community. And making those lifestyle changes has helped so many people. So if you know someone who has PCOS, or if you have PCOS, that's a sign of insulin resistance. Sarcopenia, this is just muscle loss. So as we get older, we naturally lose muscle. And if we're losing muscle really quickly or fast, that's a sign of insulin resistance. So having migraines, arthritis, stroke, dementia. Dementia, Alzheimer's is known as type 3 diabetes, and it all has to come down to insulin resistance. Body fat, like I said, sometimes when you have insulin resistance, your blood sugars, you won't see an immediate rise in your blood sugars for up to 10 years, but you'll notice that and I see this with a lot of women, right? As they approach menopause, that they carry more fat. They never used to have a belly, but now all of a sudden, they do. And they have like that tire, right? That's not good. And that's a sign of insulin resistance. So your body fat increases. And then obviously diabetes can also result from insulin resistance, heart disease as well, cancer. So pretty much like so many of the diseases that we see today, a lot of these chronic diseases has to do with insulin resistance, which is a relationship between the blood sugar in our body as well as our insulin that's being produced. So please let me know if you guys have any questions or if you want me to explain anything. I know this is like a lot of information, perhaps. Right. So some of the risk factors for South Asians, okay? So we already know, and this is seen in babies that are, born in Canada that just have South Asian parents. So they have less muscle and more abdominal fat, right? Which we know that when the more fat you have around your organs, that is going to increase your insulin resistance because your insulin has to work really hard to fight through that fat to kind of get the sugars into the cells, okay? So BMI, which is your body mass index. And to be quite honest, I really don't like using this number because it doesn't really give us the full picture. But for South Asians, they've lowered this cutoff because they know that South Asian is such a high risk. So usually it's a BMI greater than 25 for like non-Asian people. But for Asian people, you're already at a risk if you're at 23. Waist circumference, this is something that is very important. This is way more important than your weight, okay? So if your waist circumference is, if you're a male, if it's greater than 35.5 inches, that's a sign of insulin resistance. If you're a female with a waist size greater than 31.5 inches or greater than 80 centimeters, that's a sign of insulin resistance. And usually this is the first sign that we want to look at, okay? Smoking, that puts you at a high risk. There are a lot of South Asian, typically males, I guess, that do smoke. Hopefully, this is changing with all the awareness that we have. Our sedentary lifestyle, so not moving very much. So studies have shown this, typically South Asian women tend to have more of a sedentary lifestyle, however, but even with so many of us, working from home, just having a desk job doesn't help the situation either. Okay. And then our diet, right? The white rice, the refined grains that we're having, I'm going to go into detail about the South Asian diet. And then the availability of fast food and processed foods and sugary drinks that we're just exposed to, which is really interesting. And I was reading the study that looked at, South Asians that recently, South Asians that recently moved to the US. And, they were at a, healthy weight. They were all healthy. Blood work looked great. But just living in North America for 6 months, they did gain some weight. And that just, it was crazy what it did to their blood work because they were so used to eating a traditional South Asian diet and then being exposed to like the North American diet, their body doesn't, it just didn't respond well, right? So because of these risk factors that we have, the processed foods, the fast food, all that kind of the availability, the abundance of, like packaged stuff that we have in North America doesn't respond well to our genetic makeup, which puts us at such a high risk. All right. Even just going to like Tim Hortons to get a coffee, right? Like I think a few years ago, they increased their sizes. So now they have like some, I don't know, like a really, like instead of a large, now they have a extra large or something like that. Like it's just crazy what the food industry is doing in terms of really expanding their portions, which is incredibly unfortunate for so many of us, because our bodies are not designed to handle all of this sugar and these calories because of the way our genetic makeup is. All right, so I hope you guys can see this. So visceral fat. So remember, I told you guys that we as South Asians just have more visceral fat, which is known as belly fat, which is just the fat surrounding our organs. Okay, so the fat just underneath our skin that you can actually grab right now, that is subcutaneous fat. Okay, that's not as dangerous as the visceral fat. So the visceral fat wraps around your organs. And it's really interesting because this fat that we have is very inflammatory. They create certain proteins in the visceral fat that are very, very inflammatory. And that can interfere with our organ function. Okay. So it's really important that we want to kind of reduce our visceral fat or really change our lifestyle so we can minimize the amount of visceral fat that we have. And we can definitely work on it. So the higher body fat is associated with type 2 diabetes, stroke, heart disease, and some cancers. So a healthy body is one where, as you can see, this image is a bit misleading because you can be thin and have a lot of visceral fat. You could have a flat stomach, but just have more visceral fat. But in this diagram, it just shows that this person doesn't have a lot of visceral fat. It's more of a lean body, and they are at a healthier advantage because of that. Okay, so the dangers of visceral fat, right? So I already explained to you that there's subcutaneous fat, which is just underneath our skin, so we can actually touch, we can pinch our waist or whatever. That's our subcutaneous fat. A visceral fat, we can't see it, we can't touch it because it's surrounding our organs. So all of this. So do you see that, like, our core, our midsection, this is where our kidneys are, our stomach is, our pancreas is. All our vital organs are right around here. So when they're surrounded by this visceral fat that's incredibly inflammatory, it just puts us at such a high risk, right? So, what's interesting is that visceral fat makes certain proteins that inflame your body's tissues and organs and narrows your blood vessels. Okay, so when our blood vessels are narrow, um, the blood is not able to flow properly. So, it creates a lot of pressure, which then leads to high blood pressure, cholesterol, and diabetes. So, like I mentioned earlier, you may even have a flat tummy because you could have very little subcutaneous fat, but you still have a lot of visceral fat because we can't see it. And visceral fat is biologically active. So I don't want you to just think of visceral fat as just fat. I want you to think of it actually like an organ or a gland because it produces hormones and other substances that can really affect your health, right? So that inflammation, it sends out inflammation markers, and that's why even with COVID, so people who have more fat, visceral fat, and they contract COVID, it's like a huge metabolic storm because those inflammatory markers it's just like a storm in our body, right? That's why people who have chronic condition like heart disease or diabetes, are such a high risk for developing COVID. And one reason of this is the cytokines, which is an inflammatory marker in our visceral fat. Because remember, the visceral fat, produces substances, that attack, our body, which is obviously not good. So the substances released by visceral fat, which includes free fatty acids, enter a vein and travel to the liver, where they can influence the production of blood lipids. Okay, so when you have visceral fat, or one way to see in your body if you have it is through blood work. So you will have a higher total cholesterol and LDL, which is your bad cholesterol, and you will have a low HDL, which is what we want it to be high. That's going to be low. And that is a sign of insulin resistance. So if you have a copy of your blood work, you can look to see, is your HDL levels low? And then is your LDL high? So that combination in itself will tell you whether you have insulin resistance. Okay. Um, Hopefully this makes sense. Okay. So what are some of the risk factors for insulin resistance? I kind of touched on this on the last slide. So the first thing you want to look at is your family history. Okay. So if you have a history of diabetes in your family, or if you've had gestational diabetes, which is during pregnancy, or if your mom had gestational diabetes, or if you have any kind of history of diabetes in your family, that just puts you at such a high risk. You know, having a sedentary lifestyle, not moving your body, not exercising, that's going to put you at risk. Okay. Your race, so that I talked about, right? Certain ethnic groups, South Asian being one of them, we are just at, that's a high risk group. Age. So the older you get, the more your risk increases. Because think about it, right? As we get older, our body is aging as well. Our organs are not working as efficiently as it did, when we were in our 20s. So as you get older, that puts you at a risk as well. Then your blood work. So high triglycerides. So that is a huge sign that there is insulin resistance going on when your triglycerides. So triglycerides is a cholesterol, but it's a type of fat that your body is not able to metabolize and it's floating in your bloodstream, which is very inflammatory. And those who have high triglycerides, I usually see high blood sugars as well because they work the same way, right? And then our low HDL and high LDL. This, is something, if you haven't got blood work done recently in the last year, I highly recommend that you do. So you can look at these trends and you can work on them. They're actually, reducing your triglycerides is it's a great way to start. It's, just making some small diet changes can really reverse that. It's a very sensitive measure, and that can be so helpful. And obviously, a low HDL, one way to increase that is through exercise, and a high LDL is that we want to look at our diet to reduce some of that saturated fat. And then your A1C. So the A1C is, you always want to get your A1C measured, and you always want to look at the trends. You want to see, what was it last time you got your blood work done? And if you're someone living with PCOS, prediabetes, or diabetes, your A1C is a number you should always know. And the reason is because this is a direct measure. It's a very comprehensive blood test, very simple to get done, but it's very comprehensive because it looks at your red blood cell. So your red blood cell lives in your body for up to 3 months. So it gives you a really good number, or like a good indication of your lifestyle over the last 3 months. So when you get your A1C tested, it's looking at the amount of sugar, the amount of glucose that's stuck on your red blood cell. And if we have a number higher than 5.5, this puts us at risk. So in Canada, the high risk category is between 5.5 to 5.9. Anything greater than 5.9 is to 6.4 is the prediabetes phase. So we want to keep our A1C less than 5.5, because if it's higher than 5.5, we're just at risk. So if you've got blood work done in the last 3-6 months, take a look. If you haven't gotten your blood work done in the past year, get it done and look at this number. And I have worked with so many people, and it's really sad because their doctors don't tell them this. They don't tell them whether their A1C is trending up. They'll tell them like if they've hit pre-diabetes, but you can catch this even earlier than that. So, don't depend on your doctor to tell you whether you're at risk or not, because it depends on the doctor, but they're so busy, they're not going to tell you whether you're at risk or not. It depends on the doctor. So take a look at yourself to figure out, okay, what was it the last time you got your blood work done? Is it trending upwards? Is it the same? And that's going to be really profound to help you reduce your risk. And then certain medications can put you at risk for insulin resistance, especially if you're on like some kind of steroid. Poor sleeping habits. This is also really key because when our body is not getting enough rest, it puts us in a very stressful state, and that can really drive our insulin higher. Smoking, huge risk factor. High waist circumference, this is what you want to look at, like I mentioned earlier. So the ones that are in bold is that I want you to, if you feel like, oh, I don't know if I have insulin resistance or how do I know, I want you to look at these three things: your family history, your cholesterol profile, and your waist circumference. All right. If all of these are high, then you probably have insulin resistance. If not, then you're okay, but I definitely want you to keep this in mind. And then obviously our diet, which is having more processed carbs and high fat, which is low in fiber and low in omega-3s. This doesn't help as well, right? This puts us at a higher risk for insulin resistance. All right, so we are going to talk a little bit more about the food stuff, which is what I absolutely love to do. And hopefully, you guys will have some really great takeaways on what you can do to improve your diet to kind of reduce that risk that we have. So, I wanted to first of all talk about the benefits of South Asian cuisine. There are so many wonderful, wonderful benefits of our diet, and you want to focus on whole foods that are packed with minerals, vitamins, fiber, and antioxidants. Okay. The reason why this is so important, so remember that visceral fat that we just naturally have, um, and they produce those inflammatory markers. Well, the minerals, vitamins, the fiber, and antioxidants really help prevent that, tame down that inflammation. It could really work against that. So it's so powerful. The food that we eat is so, so powerful to reduce that inflammation. And one ways of doing that is to increase, our fruit and our veggies. We want it when we are having grains, we really want to focus on having whole grains like bajra, millet, barley, really increasing our plant proteins such as beans and lentils. You know, we're so lucky because our South Asian diet, like there's so many wonderful beans and lentils that are staple, right? So our mung, our masoor, our tur dals. There's so many different kinds. So try cooking with that more often because beans and lentils have so many wonderful plant compounds, like again, that have those minerals, vitamins. They're filled with tons of fiber that really help our body. Okay, so that's something that I really want you guys to work on getting more of. Having lean proteins such as chicken, more fish in our diet, and eggs, and then healthy fats such as avocados, nuts, seeds, and olive oil. And then, our spices are so wonderful. There have been tons of research that show how beneficial turmeric is for fighting inflammation, ginger, garlic, cloves, cinnamon, cayenne, black pepper. All of these spices have really potent properties that really help, with antioxidant levels and fighting inflammation. So we're lucky because we have all of these naturally in our diet. So using them more often is definitely wonderful and something that is encouraged. So just keep that in mind. So these are some of the wonderful factors we have. And, I want you to focus on this. I don't want you to focus on the negative, but I really want you to focus on all the wonderful features of the South Asian cuisine. So now I'm going to talk about some of the drawbacks of our cuisine. So many of our dishes can be quite heavy, like biryani and a lot of meat dishes. So red meat is inflammatory. It does have higher saturated fat, and saturated fat is what impacts our blood cholesterol. So if we are trying really hard to work on our cholesterol, decreasing the amount of red meat that you get in is going to help for sure. And then also the richness of our dishes, like butter chicken, for example, anything that's, really oily, that's going to impact our cholesterol levels as well, especially when it comes from an animal source like butter. Our foods tend to be fried, right? So samosas, bhajias, pakoras, kebabs, this is just, again, very inflammatory in our body. So we really want to minimize this. And I don't know, well, I could actually, many people have an air fryer, which honestly is so amazing. And it's such a great way to eliminate frying at home. And you can use healthier oils to coat the food so they can crisp up nicely. So if you don't have an air fryer, you really want to invest in one. Black Friday's coming up. There's going to be a lot of sales, and that is definitely a really great kitchen tool to have so you can cook healthier. All right. So please avoid frying as much as you can. And then our foods tend to be carb heavy, right? Like mandazi, tumbuas, mikati, all of these things are just refined grains and sugar. Okay. And then when you couple like a mandazi, which is high carb and high fat, that is just a huge inflammation that's happening in our body, right? And mind you, like I love these foods so much too, but it's not something that I have often at all. So having them in moderation is absolutely okay, but it's not something that should be routinely into your diet. So really take that into consideration. Our rice, our naans, parathas, right? They are very high carb, and then our desserts are really really high sugar. Um, so like gulab jamun and all of that kind of stuff, burfis, sweetened drinks. If there's one thing that you guys can really work on right away is just reduce the amount of sugar, like sugary drinks at home, like juices, sodas. Those things are just, because it's in a liquid form. So when we ingest it, we're not even chewing it. It just hits our bloodstream so quickly. So it spikes our blood sugars. And then insulin is going to need to come right away. And because if you have insulin resistance or you're not producing enough insulin, that blood sugar is just going to be floating in our body, which is, like I explained, can be very dangerous. So the number one thing is really reduce even juices like orange juice, apple juice. They're all sugar. There's nothing good about that. Like stick to the whole fruit. You're going to get less sugar and you're going to get that fiber in there because the whole fruit contains fiber. And then also our cultural expectations, right? Like many people, if they're going to someone's house or like a wedding or, like things are opening up now with COVID restrictions, right? So there are expectations and, people feel bad, if they're offered something and they don't eat it, right? Like I get it. Like that is something that as a culture, we really need to be more understanding of, right? Like, maybe if you are having people over, just offer healthier food. That could definitely be something that you guys can work, we can all work on. And then grazing, right? Having a ton of food out, so we're constantly snacking. This is not good either. And I think, like as our community, at at JCC, I think yes, there's so many great things that they have done, especially during Ramadan. Like I've been a volunteer with, preparing the salads that we have before iftars, which is so wonderful. And it's such a great way to encourage everyone to have more vegetables, especially when you're fasting, when you break your fast, to really give your body all those good nutrients. It's so wonderful that, our community does that. There's so many other communities that are like looking at us to as an example. But I think one thing that we could really work on is our fatiyas. Like knowing that as a as an ethnic group, we're such a high risk for this. Maybe there should be guidelines put in place on what's served as fatia. So maybe having fruit, like an apple or a pear. I mean, it's not as exciting, but it's so much better for us because sometimes we don't need all of those pastries and cookies and all of the other stuff. Like I don't know, that's something that I've been thinking of having kind of guidelines, right? So even with some of our meals, sometimes we have lentil dishes, which is so lovely, but sometimes like they're red meat, and all this other stuff. So I don't know, that would be interesting to kind of see what we can do there. I think that would be our next step as a community to kind of work on that. And to have guidelines in place, especially for fatia. Like I think having whole fruit would be less waste. It would be, healthier and better for our community as a whole. Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about carbohydrates and how it turns into sugar in our body. Okay, so carbohydrates is something that it is a macronutrient, so our body needs this in our it's our primary fuel source. So anything that contains carbohydrates turns into sugar in our body. Okay, so we want to really be picky when we are eating carbohydrates. We want to choose carbohydrates that slowly get digested in our body and that don't create an insulin spike. Okay, and the one way we can do this is to make sure we choose high fiber carbohydrates or complex carbs. And you can see over here in this little graph. So you have your blood sugar levels and the time, right? So if you eat something that's high GI, so let's just say this is a slice of white bread, we ingest it, it turns to sugar very quickly because white bread doesn't have any fiber in it. It's been extracted, so it's just sugar. Whereas something like a whole grain bread does have fiber in it, so it's slowly digested. So that peak, we don't see that peak. We just see a slow rise. Okay, so it's slowly digested. Our blood sugars are not going to be spiking. So when our blood sugars are more stable, that means there's less insulin that's going to need to come and take that sugar and put it into our cells. So we're going to help. So because we know that as South Asians we don't produce enough proper insulin, and then we have insulin resistance. We want to help our insulin levels. We don't want to shock it. We want to prevent the need for insulin, pretty much, right? So one way of doing that is to choose lower GI foods, which just means it's a whole grain. So that means it has fiber in it. Okay, so complex carbs contain fiber, which slows down how food is broken down in our body. And this is why when I said if you have juice or pop, it's just liquid sugar that's just hitting our bloodstream. And that's going to put anything that increases our blood sugars is going to increase our demand for insulin. And we don't want to do that. We want to support our body and our organs as much as possible. So choosing whole grains is your best bet. All right. And I will be going to a little bit more detail on the foods as well. Okay, so I talked about fiber, right? So foods that are complex carbs, like vegetables, fruits, beans, lentils, nuts, and seeds, they contain fiber. And fiber is such an amazing nutrient that does so much for us. Okay, so fiber is a carbohydrate, but our body is not able to digest it. So it passes through us. So fiber expands and takes up space in our stomach, which is great because it keeps you full for longer. So fiber is a natural appetite suppressant. So if you're looking to lose weight or reduce your inches, it's really important that you increase the fiber in your diet. Okay. And fiber is found in all plant foods. So anything that comes from a plant, going to have fiber in it. It's so great for our digestive health, for our gut microbiome. Um, Again, having a healthy gut is so important. And it helps keep your blood sugar steady because we saw in the previous slide that when we have foods that have fiber, there's a slow increase in our blood sugars. Okay. It doesn't create those spikes. It acts like a blanket and it suppresses those spikes. So it's amazing. It's like medication essentially. And it really helps prevent diseases in our body because fiber does, so many wonderful things. It keeps you full. It is good for your gut health. It reduces cholesterol and blood sugars. Because I want you to think about fiber when we ingest it. It takes up space, so it expands, but then it acts like a detox. So it acts like this magnet and it picks up all the excess hormones, all the excess blood sugars that's floating in our body, triglycerides, and then our body excretes that. So the more fiber we have, the better off we are. And I want you to focus on getting fiber from real food because of all the wonderful benefits of plant compounds. So, yes, you could take a fiber supplement, but it's not as great as getting fiber from whole food, for sure. Okay, and this is a South Asian or an Asian diet pyramid, and it's something that I just want you guys to look at, I guess, to understand how our diet should be made up of, right? So obviously our activity and social connection is so important, and I think this is wonderful. There's so many programs online. Even I think with JCC, right, there's online programs that you can do for exercise, which is so wonderful. There's also there's women's soccer that the community is doing, which it's like a women's over 40 soccer that we do on Sundays. I've been playing there for the past month. It's so much fun. Just having that social connection and doing some physical activity as well. That combination is amazing. So that's already started up, like kids ball hockey and even men's soccer. Like some sports have started up again. So that's wonderful. But there's also online fitness classes, I believe, that you can join in as well. And that's such an important aspect of our culture and just to be healthy, right? Is to have that connection and engage in like physical activity. So if you're someone who doesn't like to work out, so much, or doing it on your own, there are resources that you can use that kind of has that community aspect, whether it's virtual or in person. So that's really important. And then we have our diet. This is the base of every meal, that what you want to strive for is all these like vegetables, whole foods, beans, lentils, fruit, tofu, herbs, spices. This is what we want our diet to be primarily made up of, okay? And then, we bring in some protein element as well. So chicken, fish, you really want to increase that. Eggs, and then meat, and then less often is the meats and sweets. So this is kind of like once in a while. This is like daily. So it's just kind of a good visual to see, how your diet should be made up of. And then obviously water is a fantastic beverage. It's not that exciting, but it's really good for you. And then tea as well, right? There's a lot of health benefits of tea. So obviously be mindful of how much sugar you're adding in. If you can reduce that, if you usually take 2 spoons, if you reduce that to one, there's many people who don't even have sugar. And that's another thing I really like when we had functions at mosque, there's always like the sugar-free tea and then the one with sugar. So just having that option is so helpful as well. And I don't know, I think that's great because there are really good benefits of black tea. They're like the antioxidants that they have as well. Oh, okay, so these are just some examples of balanced meals, okay? So taking a look at that Asian pyramid that I showed you guys and putting it into practice, this is what I want your plate to look like. I want it to be filled with a lot of colors, with a lot of vegetables. So yes, you can still have your chicken and your curries, but it takes up a quarter of your plate. It's not supposed to take up, the entire plate. And then we have our starches, which are moderate, right? So again, a quarter of your plate as opposed to being half your plate. So, many times I see people don't even include vegetables in their meals. So, if you are making like a meat curry or chicken curry, make a vegetable one as well to kind of help balance it out a little bit and reduce the starches that you're eating and add in more vegetables. So, this is a salad. I think this is okra, chicken, and then you have your carbs. So, you don't necessarily have to eliminate your carbs. You just want to decrease the portions and increase the vegetables that you're having. So you want to minimize this and you want to aim for this more often. And this is again, anything that's colorful, that's fruits or sorry, vegetable based is going to be so much better for you. Okay, some healthy food swaps. So a lot of our South Asian foods, potatoes are a carbohydrate. It's a starchy carb, so I want you to think of it like rice. So it turns to sugar very quickly in our body. So instead of adding potatoes, you could eliminate them. Sometimes I do that as well. Or add very little. But then you could also swap that in for non-starchy vegetables. And I feel like zucchini and eggplant do a great job. So I made like a lentil curry on Monday, and instead of potatoes, I added in eggplant, and it was so lovely. It was so great. I've also added in zucchini, or like today, I'm going to be marinating some fish, like some cod, like with masala. Instead of potatoes, I have eggplants. I'm going to add that in there. So it's a great way. So instead of potatoes, I want you guys to kind of be a bit more creative and add in other vegetables that are non-starchy, meaning they have less carbohydrate in them to naturally reduce that carbohydrate. So if you're going to be, I don't want you to think of cutting foods out. I want you to think of replacing it so you don't feel deprived. Canola oil, this is a very standard cooking oil that's used in a lot of South Asian cooking because it doesn't have any flavor. However, it's very inflammatory, and there are so many healthier oils available, such as olive oil. This is honestly, olive oil has been studied extensively. It's very anti-inflammatory. Okay, remember, the more visceral fat we have in our body, the more inflammatory compounds we have. So by having foods like olive oil, which really help reduce inflammation, can be super useful. If you're doing heavy duty cooking, avocado oil is a great replacement for canola oil. So even ghee is okay in moderation. Again, if you're making your own ghee, that's best. Be careful because if you're at like a South Asian grocery store, sometimes the ghee that they have really don't have a lot of plant oils in them, like canola or palm oil, which is not what you want. So ghee in moderation, olive oil, avocado oil, these are great to have in your kitchen. And then white rice, yes, it turns to sugar very, very quickly. And some other Solutions. I don't know if you've ever tried cauliflower rice. I have a really lovely cauliflower rice recipe on my website. It's like an Indian spice, so it has a lot of those flavors, and it's such a great. What you can do is add cauliflower rice to white rice, so you increase the volume. And by doing this, you're also increasing your vegetable intake, and that's such a great way to increase your vegetables and decrease your white rice intake. Or you can make like a lentil rice, so adding lentils to your rice. So again, that fiber is going to slow down that blood sugar spike, like khichdi, right? So those are some solutions that you can try. And then our naans, which are white flour based, very carb heavy, reducing that to like chapati, rotli, which is whole grain based. And if you do make your own rotlis, you can also reduce the flour and add in flax powder, which is wonderful. It's such a great high fiber food to like flax powder to add in. You can add in hemp seeds again to just increase the fiber and the nutrients. So that would be a great addition if you do make your own. Again, reducing the sodas, even when we have people over. A lot of people find that, oh, I'm having guests over, then I'm going to keep juices and pop. And, you don't have to. You don't. You can eliminate this and maybe do like infused water, like getting one of those big water containers, adding in some mint leaves, some pomegranate seeds, or some, cucumbers. So it's like, a fruit infused water, which is just as fine, right? Like, which is really nice. So you're cutting out all that excess sugar out. And then having the Indian sweets. So, especially jalebi, which is all sugar and then it's deep fried and then there's colors added to it. Just, not having this and having fresh fruit as a dessert option, which is, I think a lot of people appreciate that. When you see a fruit platter that's been nicely cut up, it's so lovely, right? So don't feel like you feel pressure to have these foods because you think that everyone, or you feel like you need to, just offer these instead and see what happens. And then again, with our meat dishes, reducing our red meat intake to like twice a week or even once a week would be great. And adding more fish, more beans and lentils to our diet, with our wonderful spices are a great way, or some healthy swaps that you can incorporate. Oh gosh, I'm like getting tight on time. And then exercise and sleep, really, really important. So when it comes to blood sugar management, exercise is like literally allows our muscles to take up sugar, which is exactly what we want. We don't want that sugar to end up in our fat cells. We want it to be used for energy. And one way to do that is to move your body. So going outside for a walk, even like if you have prediabetes or some insulin resistance, let's say you had a big meal, just going for a walk for 10 or 15 minutes can do wonders for reducing your blood sugars. Okay, so you don't have to do anything crazy. Just going out for walks can really, really help, especially after meals. Strength training. This is really important as well. The more muscle, so remember, South Asians typically have less muscle, and obviously as we get older, we lose that muscle too. So building your muscular strength is so, so important. So this is going to help with your posture. It's going to help with your bone health. It's also going to improve your insulin sensitivity. This is the one way to make your body more sensitive to insulin is to increase the muscle that you have. All right. And then aiming for 7 to 9 hours of sleep, which is the minimum. So one night of bad sleep increases your insulin resistance and blood sugars. Just one night. Because what happens is when we don't sleep well, it raises our stress hormone, which is cortisol, which cortisol directly impacts insulin. So all these hormones work together. So if one hormone is off, it's going to impact all the other guys. And insulin is honestly a primary hormone in our body that we really need to pay attention to. So if our insulin is high, then our cortisol is likely going to be high. They all affect one another. And then stress management. So really focusing on reducing your stress, saying no to things more often, putting yourself at priority. I know for women, we do take on more stress, right? So really setting boundaries for ourselves is really important, and really having a good evening and morning routine in place is somewhere that you can start, that you can take just 20 minutes to yourself, that you can kind of in the morning, starting your day with prayer and maybe some stretches, and in the evening, reciting some Quran and just kind of easing your mind so you can also sleep better too. All right. And supplements. So you always, 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 always want to focus on food first. But there are some supplements that really do help. Magnesium. So magnesium is so important, especially for women, and so many of us tend to be deficient in it. And magnesium really helps your body's ability to secrete insulin. Okay, so we know that South Asians, we can't secrete insulin that well. So, really increasing our diet with magnesium rich foods. So, foods are naturally high in fiber. And this is why food is so important, right? And you don't want to resort to a supplement. So, foods that are naturally high in fiber are going to be high in magnesium. So, it's amazing. So, when you increase the whole foods in your diet, you're getting all of those nutrients in. So, even taking a magnesium supplement in the evening would be helpful if you do have insulin resistance, or even if you don't. It relaxes your blood vessels, it relaxes your mind, and it's like nature's chill pill. It just relaxes everything and it helps your insulin levels. Vitamin D, everyone here hopefully is supplementing with vitamin D, especially now that we're in this shorter daylight hours. We're not getting exposure to sun. Many of you wear hijab, so you don't get exposure to sun very much either. So vitamin D is so, so important. If you haven't gotten your vitamin D tested, I highly recommend that you do. You do have to pay a little bit more for it, but it's so important that you just know what your levels are at. And vitamin D is important for our blood, for glucose tolerance and insulin resistance. It has an active role in regulating our beta cells, which make insulin. So, you guys learned about that today. So, really up your vitamin D. You should be taking at least 2,000 international units daily. And then omega 3s. So, omega 3s are only found in certain foods like fatty fish. So, not even all fish, the ones that live in cold water that have those protective omega 3 benefits. So, if you have an allergy to fish or you don't enjoy it, taking an omega 3 will really help fight inflammation, and lower your triglycerides and improve your insulin resistance. So, these three supplements are ones that I do recommend, and I think it would be very useful to get your vitamin D levels tested to see where you are at. And then our meal timings. Sorry, guys, I have gone over time. I'll be done in a few minutes. But having balanced meals, okay? So it's really not about cutting your carbs out, but balancing it out. So it's a small portion of your plate, and then your plate is balanced with a lot of vegetables and protein. You also want to avoid snacking. So you want to make sure you have three solid meals, and you want to avoid snacking. And the reason for this is because if you're constantly eating during the day, if you're grazing, your insulin levels are always going to be high. And we want to give our insulin a break. And one way of doing that is to going through meals without eating. Or yeah, going through so between breakfast and lunch, it's around typically 4 hours. If you're having a good breakfast, then that can sustain you, and maybe that's something you can work on. And then going from lunch to dinner, you may need a snack, um, like later on in the afternoon, because it's a longer stretch. So if it's longer than 5 hours, you want to bring in a healthy snack. But if not, try to just to really focus on eating balanced meals, and this could reduce your insulin as well. And then keep in mind that we all tend to be more insulin resistant as the day goes on. So our body's able to tolerate carbohydrates earlier on in the day. So just be mindful at dinner, with your carbohydrates. Try to have them earlier on in the day. And then intermittent fasting is such a great way to lower your insulin levels. So right now the time has changed. Many of us have to make up fasts. This would be an excellent opportunity to do our fasts, right? Because of the shorter days. So yes, and the longer we go in between our meals, it's better for our insulin levels. So again, there's less inflammation. It just really helps our body out. Um, you also want to, and if you're not there yet, just avoid evening snacking. So make dinner your last meal if you're able to. Some days, yes, you can definitely have a portioned out snack, but majority, you really want to try to keep dinner as your last meal, especially if you do have insulin resistance and you're trying to manage that. You just want to avoid that snacking. And then to curb sugar cravings, if you are someone who does tend to have a lot of sugar cravings, start with a savory breakfast. So your first meal of the day, don't make it sweet. So having a vegetable omelet is a fantastic option. that you can try. So you're really maximizing getting vegetables and protein in the morning. And by reducing the sugar at your first meal can really help regulate your sugar craving as the day progresses. And then also, if you are someone who has prediabetes or diabetes, testing your blood sugar, okay? Test your blood sugars to see where you are, to see what the foods you're eating and how that's impacting you. It's a very powerful tool in helping you figure out what works for you and your metabolic health. And I thought I had a last slide. Oh, okay. So thank you guys for joining in. If you have any questions, please let me know. I'll be more than happy to address that. But I have a free Facebook group. It's called the Blood Sugar Solution, and I do lives in there and I talk about certain topics. You can also follow me on Instagram. My website, I have a lot of recipes that you guys can check out. You can also email me. I do have a program. It's a 3-month program. It's a Master Blood Sugar Balance coaching program. So if you're someone who has been recently diagnosed with prediabetes or diabetes or even PCOS, I teach you everything in detail on what you can do to help, bring your levels back to normal. So that's something that, that I love working on with my clients. So yes, so if you have any questions, I'll be more than happy to answer that. I apologize, I did go over, but those are some ways that where you can reach me. Thanks, everyone. All right, so I don't see any questions. Oh, you're so welcome. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. Okay, grapeseed oil. Yes. So, grapeseed oil is, I mean, it is very, similar to canola in that it is refined, and the process that it goes through is there's a lot of chemicals that it goes through. So, avocado oil and olive oil would be better than grapeseed oil in a nutshell, just because the way it's been processed, the way it's been manufactured, it doesn't have some of the great benefits that avocado and olive oil have. Mm, I think I got some other. Yeah, you're welcome. That's a really great question. I do get a lot of questions on the different types of oils. And grapeseed is kind of like, a lot of people find that it's a very healthy oil, and it's very mild in flavor, but it's not as good as avocado and olive oil. All right, everyone. Well, thank you so much for tuning in. And again, if you have any other questions, you can definitely reach out to me and I'll be more than happy to answer your questions. Okay, take care. Kudafis.
Anar, there's a question from Sukina Darcy. Can you
Okay.
see that? Can you see that in the
I,
chat box?
no, I don't.
She says, "Why would your sugars be high in the morning, and as the day progresses, it comes down?"
Yeah. Okay. So, um, I don't see that question. So sometimes, oh wait, hold on. No, I don't see that question. So why would the sugars be high in the morning and decrease as they come down? Okay, so this could be your liver. So what happens when we sleep overnight is that our liver, and this is just the job of the liver, automatically sends blood sugars to our body just for coverage. And sometimes our liver produces too much of that. And then as you wake up with high blood sugars, and then obviously you move your body and then you kind of get on with your day, that can help regulate your blood sugars. But if you do notice your blood sugars are high in the morning, it has to do with your liver. And you can try even doing some walking in the evening time, really reducing the carbs at your dinner meal, to see how you can bring that to a normal level. So you would just need to play around with what you're doing in the evening that could be resulting in high blood sugars in the morning. Or I'm not sure if you do take any medications. Um, if you do, you can let me know. Oh, okay. Yes, but you can try playing around in your evening hours. So try to have 3 hours between when you eat to when you go to sleep. Do some movement in the evening again, so that your body takes up all that sugar, and see what your blood sugars are at. It could also be that if you're not sleeping properly either. When we don't sleep, our body's in a stressful state, and that stress can, elevate our blood sugars. So there's not one answer, but there's a variety of things that you can look at. I don't know if there was any other questions because I don't see the chat box. Oh, okay. Now I see it. You're welcome, Sakina. Oh, here. Okay, now I can see that I had to press a button. Thanks, Tyra. All right. So thanks so much for having me, and I will chat with you guys soon. Kadafis.